pricing as the index versus the NYMEX. So obviously it's something you need to take into consideration. And while we're discussing over-the-counter deals, one thing I would say, I think certainly in economic and financial markets as we have now, one needs to be aware of credit risk. I mean, if you put in a hedge in place, you want to make sure your counterparty's around at the end of the term to honor the deal. The first piece of advice we've had for ourselves in-house is just we want to know our counterparty, and I would suggest that that's worth looking at. Who are you dealing with? What is their credit position? Even if they're a premier name, it's a sort of market where it's probably worthwhile spending some time to know your counterparty if you're going to be doing substantial deals over the counter. And then assessing that, depending on what sort of models you're using to measure what your potential market risk is, in addition to just the counterparty credit risk. I think the typical approaches to it in managing the credit risk probably similar to what you would have in foreign exchange or interest rate management, setting limits. If there are swaps involved, there are some typical structures to put in place, margins or collateral arrangements, not margins in the sense that allowed in the sense that futures trading margins, but collateral arrangements after some threshold amount of credit exposure has been built. And those sort of arrangements should be reciprocal, not just from the corporations having to offer collateral at some threshold, but the counterparty, the financial institution, having a reciprocal arrangement. In terms of some items that tended to be issues for us, and as I think if you progress on an energy management program, you may find are the sort of questions that would come up in structuring your own in-house program. The question of resources, I think, at least on the startup, it's a time-consuming effort to set up the reporting and also to build the market expertise. I mean, there's certainly a lot of experts available to you from all the banks and trading companies you deal with, but although the risk management technology I think is very transferable, very similar between the instruments in the financial markets and other commodities, there is certainly some market expertise to come up to speed to be somewhat expert or familiar with the phenomena in the energy markets will require some time. Just to give you what our action plan was, and I think a very logical checklist, but one you might find useful. First, as we talked about, identifying what our exposures were, then really defining what our view was on the risk of those, establishing the policy along the lines we discussed on a somewhat formalized basis, just so everyone understands the rules of the road and what our objectives were, and then implementing the strategies. And subsequently monitoring and the performance on the program and adjusting strategies, adjusting the policy even if need be. But I think the trends as we would see them for generally commodities and certainly for risk management, as long as we have this volatility as we do now, I think it's increased the sort of awareness at the very top level. Anyone's reading the newspaper, whether it's the chairman or the president or the CEO, is going to be aware of the volatility in the market. And I think it's certainly increased the corporate focus on trying to manage this component of our business. I think you're going to see more corporations, more end users. Any producers or refiners, I believe, are already been active in trying to manage this element. But for corporate end users like ourselves, I think you're going to see more formalized hedge programs, more activity in this area. Certainly it's a growth industry for the banks right now. I think a lot of your friends in banking have been focusing a lot of efforts on this. It's a volatile market. There's risk. There's now the recognition of the risk. And hence we've seen a lot of proliferation in terms of additional hedge instruments. I think you're going to see more products offered. There's already, I think, greater liquidity in the market, and I think that'll build. And again, following the trends that we've seen in risk management in other areas. And to the extent that you have a need to meet your hedge programs, your hedge objectives, you need some type of specialized or varied structure. I think you can find it in the market. There are going to be innovations, I think, in the area of risk management. So that's sort of to encapsulates where Pepsi has been in the area. And if anyone has any questions or wants to share any ideas on the area, I'd be delighted to talk with you on them. Any questions? Yeah.
I'd be very interested in hearing about the reporting system that you put in place. How often do people tell you about their fuel usage? How do you track it?
Right.
All that?
Well, I think there's, that's a good question, which also, a second issue that came up for us, aside from our internal reporting, was did we need any additional tools from the outside? The reporting we have, I wouldn't consider particularly advanced online, real-time reporting from the field, that sort of thing, but really on a scheduled basis. We have also looked at some test cases for this, going back to evaluating our local buying programs. We selected some locations that we thought were good samples in terms of total volumes to look at and do a very in-depth study looking back for a year, how they approach their local buying arrangements, who are they dealing with, what has their pricing been against some reference like the OPIC index. And this is part of the accumulating some data history to do optimize the local buying program. But in terms of reporting, we have what I view as a rather simple report. We define the formats of what do we need to know at every location, and simply how's it going to be reported into us. The other issue that's sort of still underway is how can we reporting in the other direction, where we're trying to look at a corporate-wide, headquarters-controlled national buying programs in the spot market where we're staying spot. How do we disseminate that information on a daily basis to the field? I think there's where from a systems or MIS standpoint, is going to be the more difficult requirement for us. We've looked at electronic mail, some of the electronic mail systems we've had in place. Can we use those? And I'd say so far that's not resolved. Some limited success, but again, it may get back to the structure of your company. If you're very decentralized, if you're a number of different divisions and you're trying to manage this on a headquarter basis for a number of divisions, different systems, different formats, it may be a little more difficult. But I think the basic information you need, the ones we looked at in the slide a moment ago, I mean, exactly what are the volumes, what are the products, and not just an aggregate for the year. We wanted to know on a projected basis what were the, how much and when on a daily basis, so that we could look at seasonal patterns and how great were our basis risks in various seasons. And the other point although it's not really reporting, but data systems to be able to track the market, the question we had was whether do we need additional services, additional consultants, additional reporting systems. And what we found was, if you have Reuters or Telerate or Knight Ridder, Commodity News Service, Future Source, all those have available extensive information, both the market information, market outlooks, news event reporting, and prices on all the exchange. You may have to pay, subscribe to an additional exchange fee for NYMEX or IPE, whatever you need, but I think you'll find a lot of the electronic equipment you already have in place for your other programs, foreign exchange or interest rate, are going to give you the tools you need for the energy management. So that's sort of the long answer, but any other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I wasn't aware. How much of your program is based more on forwards versus futures, or?
Yeah, let me repeat the question just for the audience and for the taping. If I've understood the question, how common are forward rate agreements in the physicals market, as opposed to futures trading or commodity swaps or something of that nature? I don't think they're common. I think they're becoming more common simply because the users are demanding them. It's the easy hedge. It may not be the most cost effective, but if you're dealing with a local supplier, and I'm not talking about a local distributor, Bubba Smith's local oil service company, but a national arrangement or at least a major regional supplier, which you're a customer to as an end user, can they make a price hedge to you where they've presumably worked with a financial intermediary to lay off their risk from using a futures contract, and also probably laying off their basis risk by committing a pipe transportation for the fuel from New York Harbor to Philadelphia, or whatever the local market is that they're providing you the forward hedge in. So I guess to answer your question again, I don't think they're common. I think they're becoming more available, and I think more users are asking for them from their supply networks. So
right now, you guys are using more futures than forwards, simply because the forwards are developed?
I'd say more of a combination of things depending on the market. I mean, if the basis risk is viewed as relatively, and I'm thinking primarily to diesel, if the basis risk is viewed as relatively stable or manageable for a particular region, remember our uses are all over the country, is the appropriate hedge for our West Coast energy exposures the same hedge as for the Northeast? Well, maybe not. Maybe futures are a more manageable position for and more manageable basis risk in the Northeast than the West Coast. So maybe the forward arrangements in the West Coast market are more attractive. So I would think it's probably for an end user with similar in a transportation company, for example, or which I would view us as sort of being in the freight business in a way. I mean, we're delivering X number of millions of cases of food products and beverages. So we probably have the same use profile that a transportation company would have. I think it may be a combination of hedges that are most cost effective. Another factor I think is talking about the policy and the authority. Who's assuming the gain and loss on the thing, and who's then participating in the management of it? If the division has a distinct view as to where the markets are going and having some input, and since they're going to, in their profit center, assume the gains and losses on the hedge, they may have an orientation of wanting to pay a high premium in a volatile market and lock in a over-the-counter cap. So I think it's a function of the exposures, your organizational politics, and the cost effectiveness of the various instruments. So, yeah, John.
How do you go about defining the length of time defining your exposure period?
Well, I guess our exposure is really in perpetuity, but just like your foreign exchange positions at Carbide. And just to repeat the question again for anyone that didn't hear it and for the tape, John was asking, how do we go about defining what our time duration was for the exposure? And again, I think it's the underlying exposure risk level, or at least the exposure, is in perpetuity. I think our time frame tends to be a little shorter term than wanting to lock in a 5-year swap, something of that nature. I think we tend to look at a business cycle, hedging out the remainder of this year if prices have moved to a new level that look attractive to us. Going back to what are our objectives in the policy? Well, is it to lock in a plan number that if we lock in this component, along with the other components we've locked in on our cost structure, it assures we're going to get to the plan for the year? Well, maybe that defines the time frame. And then in the planning stage for the following year, which raises another interesting aside. I think the new volatility in the market may change the planning process, and I mean budgeting process in companies where there's a transportation company that may have not put a lot of focus toward planning for and budgeting for the energy cost. I think that's probably changed, and it certainly has for us. So if that answers your question, I guess relatively short term, even though management of it, although exposure is just is in perpetuity. So, any other questions? Yes.
Can you comment a little bit about the accounting tax treatments of those instruments how you go about it.
Yeah, that's one of the things I'd intended to touch on. I think there are some accounting and tax issues for any of the hedges. And just again, to repeat the question for the tape.